March 27, 1993, Eisenhower Expressway near Wolf Road, Hillside, Illinois. A van drifts into position. The side door slides open. A rifle appears first, then the fire. Bullets tear into a white Caprice in broad daylight. Glass rains over a woman and a child in the back seat. The driver slams the wheel, bleeding, trying to outrun men who came to finish a king. Traffic breaks apart in panic. The car jumps lanes, crashes. The gunmen keep shooting. Everyone on that stretch of road thinks the target is inside. But Willie Lloyd is not in the car. He has vanished into the suburbs, hiding in a Deerfield hotel while still ruling Chicago's West Side by telephone, like an exiled monarch ordering tribute from men who once called him leader. And that is what made this attack different. This was not a war with strangers, not a feud with a rival nation. It began the night before, in a West Side apartment, when one of Lloyd's own lieutenants was held until a debt was paid. $6,000, a street tax, a ransom dressed up as discipline. What exploded on the expressway was not just revenge. It was the moment a prison-forged hierarchy turned inward and began to devour itself. Before he was a target on an expressway, Willie Lloyd was a product of West Garfield Park, a place where abandoned authority left room for another kind. He entered the Vice Lords as a boy, around 1964, and by 1967 he had already helped form his own branch, the Unknown Vice Lords, with the blessing of senior leadership from the Vice Lord Holy City. That detail matters. Lloyd was not a reckless outsider improvising violence on a corner. He came up inside a hierarchy. He understood rank, sanction, tribute, and the theater of command long before he mastered the street economy that would later make him feared. Prison did not interrupt that education. It completed it. In the Midwest underworld of the 1960s and 1970s, incarceration was not merely punishment. It was a school of structure. Men entered as neighborhood fighters and came out thinking like administrators of power. Lloyd's murder conviction in the 1971 killing of Davenport police officer Michael Farnsworth sent him away for years, but distance did not erase him. According to chroniclers of the Vice Lords, he retained influence even while locked up in Iowa, learning the lesson that would define his reign. Physical absence could be overcome if the myth of authority stayed alive. That is who they really were. Not just a prison hustle crew, not just street dealers with guns. They were men shaped by an older Chicago logic, where criminal power borrowed the language of nationhood, politics, and loyalty to disguise what it really was: organized extraction from neighborhoods too weak, too neglected, and too frightened to resist. Willie Lloyd's real power did not come from chaos. It came from order. By the time he emerged as a major Vice Lord figure, he understood that fear alone was unstable. Fear had to be organized. So the old neighborhood gang was hardened into something closer to a disciplined revenue system. Lloyd had already built a reputation for controlling operations even while incarcerated. When he returned to Chicago in 1986, chroniclers of the Vice Lords describe him as having risen high enough inside the almighty Vice Lord nation to command not just the unknowns, but influence across multiple branches. That mattered on the street. It meant that younger hustlers were not simply dealing under a local set. They were paying into a hierarchy that claimed legitimacy, history, and sanction from above. Under Lloyd, the machine worked through tribute. The street corner became a tax base. Drug crews were expected to earn, report, and pay. Police later described his strategy after his 1992 release in blunt terms. He wanted to consolidate West Side drug traffic under his dominion. The method was not subtle. Street taxes, demands for money, obedience enforced by abduction, intimidation, and the threat of exemplary violence. Even while hiding in a Deerfield hotel, Lloyd allegedly ran the organization by telephone, removed from the neighborhood but still extracting from it. That distance made him look less like a local gang chief and more like a ruler governing through intermediaries. That is how a prison-forged crew becomes an extortion machine, not by becoming bigger than the streets, but by teaching the streets to treat tribute as normal. Publicly, this could be dressed in the language of rank, unity, even political discipline. Privately, it was a business model built on compelled payment. And every such empire contains the seed of its own revolt. The moment the soldiers stop believing they are protected and realize they are only being milked. Lloyd enforced loyalty the way old bosses always do, by making discipline visible. On the street, tribute was not a suggestion. It was the proof that rank still meant something. Dealers paid street taxes. Lieutenants were expected to forward money upward. If someone hesitated, the argument was no longer about cash. It became a test of sovereignty. Prosecutors later described Lloyd's post-prison strategy as an effort to consolidate West Side drug traffic under his command. In that system, payment was obedience, and refusal was rebellion. But Lloyd's methods had been shaped long before 1993. Prison had taught him that power survives through chain of command, ritual, and memory. Even while incarcerated, he was described as retaining influence over unknown vice lord operations. That is the crucial transformation. The crew no longer needed the boss on the corner. It needed only the belief that his word could still travel through cells, visiting rooms, telephones, and trusted intermediaries. In prison, hierarchy became doctrine. On the street, doctrine became debt collection. By March 1993, that model began to crack. Testimony later alleged that Cardell Williams was to be dealt with seriously over a $6,000 dispute, with those present given license to shoot, break legs, kill, whatever. That language reveals everything. Loyalty was no longer secured by protection, it was enforced by spectacle. Punishment had to be public enough to frighten the rest, and once a ruler must terrorize his own lieutenants to collect tribute, the machine is already turning inward. The organization still looked disciplined from the outside. Inside, it was rotting. The first sign that Lloyd's system was failing did not come from a courtroom or a police raid. It came from inside the machine itself. Men who had once accepted tribute as the price of belonging began to see it for what it was: extraction without protection, rank without reward. Investigators later summarized the mood in brutal terms. Willie was all take and no give. That is when an organization stops functioning like a hierarchy and starts behaving like a hostage structure. The lieutenants were no longer being managed, they were being squeezed. That shift changed everything. Once tribute becomes extortion, every subordinate begins quietly measuring the distance between obedience and survival. Cardell Williams was not just a disgruntled lieutenant, he was evidence that Lloyd's old formula no longer worked on a younger generation of earners. They had guns, crews, corners, and money of their own. They did not see themselves as servants to a returning monarch. They saw a man trying to collect on a reputation built in prison and preserved by fear. And as the internal discipline broke down, the state began to move in through the cracks. A year-long investigation would eventually use surveillance, taped drug buys, and an undercover informant to dismantle the upper ranks of the unknown vice lords. Informants do not destroy strong organizations. They enter when loyalty has already decayed. By then, Lloyd's empire was still armed, still feared, still theatrical. But beneath the surface, it had begun to confess against itself. By the spring of 1993, Willie Lloyd was no longer ruling from the block. He was ruling from hiding. After his January homecoming drew police raids and constant attention, he withdrew to a Marriott in Deerfield with a smaller inner circle, convinced his West Side home had been compromised. That detail matters. Men like Lloyd build their legend on visibility, the fur coat, the limousines, the entourage. But now, the self-proclaimed King of Kings was living inconspicuously in the suburbs, issuing orders by telephone, separated from the very streets he claimed to command. Power was still flowing through him, but presence was gone. And in organized crime, absence creates doubt. That isolation changed the emotional climate of the organization. On paper, the hierarchy remained intact. In reality, Lloyd was becoming a remote collector of debts, a voice on the line demanding tribute from men who were taking the daily risks. The old prison logic still shaped him. Command could travel through intermediaries, and fear could survive at a distance. But the street does not respect theory for long. Soldiers who once saw rank began seeing weakness. If the boss needed hotel rooms, chauffeurs, escorts, and suburban refuge, then his authority no longer looked invincible. It looked hunted. Then came the debt dispute that exposed everything. Prosecutors alleged Lloyd ordered Cardell Williams seized over $6,000 he claimed was owed to him from drug money. Williams later testified that the order was not merely to pressure him, but to deal with him seriously, with permission to shoot, break legs, kill, whatever. This was no longer internal discipline in the old sense. It was the language of a ruler who no longer trusted loyalty and had begun replacing it with terror. When tribute must be collected at gunpoint from your own lieutenants, betrayal is no longer a risk waiting in the distance. It is already in the room. The psychological turn was just as important as the criminal one. Lloyd had built a system where men obeyed because they believed he could still reach them anywhere, in prison, on the street, inside their own faction. But once Cardell and Tyrone Williams chose retaliation, the mythology ruptured. Now the soldiers were no longer whispering about Lloyd's reach. They were testing its limits. In March, rivals from within his own unknown vice lord's faction allegedly tracked a car they believed carried him and opened fire on the Eisenhower. By October, another broad daylight ambush would leave him wounded in the leg after court. Police believed his own disgruntled men may have plotted both attacks. The betrayal was no longer hidden beneath ceremony. It had become public, ballistic, undeniable. And this is where empires usually die, not at the hands of the outside enemy they spent years preparing for, but in the private moment when fear stops flowing downward and starts moving upward instead. Lloyd was still armed, still feared, still capable of violence. But he was now watching his own men the way a hunted man watches the street through hotel curtains. The king had not fallen yet, but he was already alone. The execution began as punishment and ended as mutiny. In March 1993, Lloyd allegedly ordered Lieutenant Cardell Williams kidnapped over $6,000 in disputed drug money, then held through intermediaries until payment was made. Tyrone Williams, Cardell's brother, surrendered a Mercedes-Benz to secure his release. What mattered was not the amount, it was the message. Lloyd was reminding the West Side that tribute still flowed upward, that rank still had teeth, and that even his own men could be seized if they forgot who claimed the throne. But the lesson cut both ways. By the next day, the Williams faction answered with open war. On the Eisenhower Expressway, a van pulled alongside a white Caprice believed to be carrying Lloyd. Gunmen opened fire in broad daylight with heavy weapons, shattering glass and tearing into the vehicle. The driver was wounded. Lloyd's infant son was inside. Lloyd was not. He had escaped the kill zone, but not the meaning of it. His own organization had now attempted to execute him in public. The boss survived. The myth did not. Once a ruler becomes prey to his own soldiers, every order sounds weaker, every bodyguard looks temporary, and every car feels empty before the bullets arrive. After the ambushes, the organization did not recover. It unraveled. What had once looked like a disciplined chain of command now looked to investigators like a wounded machine leaking fear, grudges, and evidence. The street war drew attention, but the real damage came in quieter forms. Intercepted conversations, cooperating witnesses, and men who no longer believed silence was worth dying for. In December 1993, Shelton Williams broke one of the oldest taboos in gang culture and testified that Lloyd had ordered Cardell Williams to be dealt with seriously over the $6,000 dispute. That testimony mattered because it exposed the inner logic of Lloyd's rule. Tribute was not loyalty, it was coercion. And once that truth entered a courtroom, the mythology began to thin. Law enforcement moved through the opening with patience. According to the Chicago Tribune, a year-long investigation combined surveillance, undercover work, taped drug buys, and an informant to map the upper ranks of the unknown vice lords. On April 13, 1994, that effort culminated in the arrest of 29 upper echelon members. The paper framed it as the effective disappearance of the unknown vice lords from the street. That wording was not poetic, it was administrative. The kind of language the state uses when it believes an empire has been reduced to files, indictments, and evidence lockers. But the deeper fallout was moral and structural. Lloyd had returned from prison in limousines and furs, staged like a sovereign reclaiming his kingdom. Barely more than a year later, the kingdom was cannibalizing itself. His own lieutenants had tried to kill him. His own system had produced informants. His own methods had invited the state inside. Organized crime often presents itself as an alternative order. In truth, it survives only while men believe the ruler can protect what he extracts. Willie Lloyd could still demand, he could still threaten, but by 1994, he could no longer hold the center. In the end, the most revealing image is still that white car on the Eisenhower, bullets punching through metal, glass falling over a child, gunmen convinced they were killing a king, and the seat where Willie Lloyd should have been, empty. That emptiness is the whole story. Organized crime survives by persuading men that power is physical, permanent, and close at hand. But Lloyd's empire was already becoming something else by 1993. Remote, suspicious, ceremonial. He was ruling from hotel rooms, through telephones, through memory, through fear. The structure still existed. The belief inside it did not. That is what this case reveals about organized crime. It does not collapse simply because the police arrive. It begins collapsing when the private motive can no longer hide beneath the public language of loyalty, nation, and order. Lloyd came from a world where prison elevated men, where hierarchy could travel through walls, and where political fronts could mask criminal ambition. But the deeper truth was simpler. Tribute had replaced loyalty. Extraction had replaced protection. The soldiers saw it. The informants proved it. The state only entered after the myth had already been broken from within. Years later, Lloyd would be shot again, left paralyzed, and spend the last stretch of his life in a wheelchair, a body still present after the kingdom had already vanished. There is something almost classical in that ending. Not justice, not redemption, just duration. A man living on after the system that made him feared had rotted away. In that sense, the empty car was prophecy. The bullets came for a throne that no longer truly existed. And like so many empires built on fear, it did not die in one burst of violence. It died first in the minds of its own believers, then slowly in public, until all that remained was a name, a file, and the silence after gunfire.